Do you want to feel engaged and vital in the third of life? Then, don't take chances with your future. Be in the know with the 5 life shifts of adulthood: caregiving, moving, career encoring, grandparenting, and living singly. Our featured speaker is Lori Bitter. Lori is the CEO of the Business of Aging and is the author of The Grandparent Economy. Lori has more than 30 years' experience in advertising, PR, strategic planning as president of J. Walter Thompson Boomer Division, leader of client services for AgeWave Impact, Next Avenue influencer, and board member for several nonprofits and startups. In this episode of Pause for Purpose, Lori Bitter draws from the latest research sponsored by AARP, P&G, and Wells Fargo, and shares the highlights.
Today, we are really fortunate to have a friend of ours. Both Joyce and I have known Lori for a number of years, and there are a number of other people on this Zoom call who also know Lori in her professionalism. Lori is the CEO of the Business of Aging, a research and insights firm that focuses on older adults. Her latest research, which we're going to see slides and more information about, Hacking Life Shifts, is sponsored by AARP, P&G, and Wells Fargo, and it focused on 5 key life shifts of adulthood: caregiving, grandparenting, living single, moving, and career encoring. The insights are gleaned from the study of career encoring speak to people what people are feeling about their need in the third age to feel engaged and vital. Lori was named a Next Avenue influencer in aging. She's an author. She wrote the book, The Grandparent Economy, which won a National Mature Market Media Award. She serves as a co-producer of the What's Next Boomer Summer, the Silicon Valley Boomer Venture Summit. She was the president of J. Walter Thompson's Boomer Division, JWT Boom, and launched her own agency, Continuum Crew, following that. Prior to that, she led client service for AgeWave. Lori has more than 30 years of advertising, public relations, and strategic planning experience. She serves on the advisory board of several startups and nonprofits. Are we lucky or what? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lori, and she's going to share some highlights from how we are shifting.
Yes, we are shifting.
And Lori, before you start, if anyone has, put yourself on mute if you're not talking, because I think there's a radio or something in the background. So just so we can have minimal distraction. Thank you. Lori, it's all yours.
Yeah, and if you hear snoring in the background, it is not me, it is a dog. And she snores very loudly, so I'll apologize in advance. It's really loud. Okay. Let's see if we can get the right, can everyone see
Yes.
Hacking Longevity? Okay. So I'll just give you a little bit of background and kind of move right into this, because I'm excited to hear what questions everyone has about this. 2 years ago, I was approached by a new research company called Collaborata when I was doing a talk on my book, The Grandparent Economy. And they asked if I'd ever wanted to do a research study that I couldn't get funded. And I said, well, let me get the list out and I'll send it over to you, because I have a lot of ideas for research against the mature consumer that no one seems to be interested in doing. And I said, the one that I'm really psyched about is understanding how people feel about the ability to live a 100-year life, or if people are even thinking about the fact that they're living longer than ever before. And if they are thinking about it, what are they doing about it? Are they taking better care of themselves? Are they saving more money? So how do we, I want to talk about that. So we launched that study, and that started the hacking series. And so Hacking Longevity was round 1 of this study. And it's not letting me, there we go, advance. So that was Collaborata, who, if you want to think of it this way, it's a crowd-funded sort of crowdfunding big research projects. And I've been very lucky that AARP has been a research partner now, going on 3 years for this research project. But I also have great partners like Procter & Gamble and Wells Fargo and Unilever and US Bank, a lot of different kinds of companies who've come into this. And RTI Research in Connecticut is my research partner for this project as well. So when we did the Hacking Longevity study, we were focused on, like I said, whether people were aware of living a 100-year life. One of the things we wanted to do was remap that map of life state, all the life stages that people go through after they're 40. We wanted to look at things like when grandparenting was happening, when second marriages were happening, when menopause was happening, all of those things that change around midlife and beyond, and see if things were changing because people were working longer, living longer, etc. And this was all part of an event that AARP had planned in DC called Living 100. The chart that you're looking at, which is really hard to read in this context, and I'll give it to Joyce as a PDF so she can share it if anybody wants to look at it, was sort of, this is a bubble map of inflection points that we found in that hacking research of when things happen. And some of the really interesting ones for us as researchers was around the age of 45, health and financial needs are really prioritized over personal growth. We thought that was really interesting because there was so much going on at the time in the purpose literature and about people looking at purpose. So what we figured out was 45 was not the place where people sort of start to think about this. They're still worried about how to meet their financial needs and their healthcare needs. And then around 50, health pulls away as a priority. And then around 60, people are kind of in this bubble of their best years. And that's when we typically see people grandparenting. They're really kind of peak careering or starting something new, which is we're going to talk about a little bit today. And they haven't typically hit that first, what I would call bump in the road health-wise, that slippery slope where things start to kind of come undone. So there was a lot that came out of this study. This chart is simply one of those, but it got us thinking more intensely about life shifts and how life shifts are sort of little small earthquakes really in people's lives and how they really transform the way people move forward. So the following year, just this last year, we decided to focus on the 5 life shifts that Vicki mentioned at the beginning. And those were, we did one huge study, but it was actually 5 micro studies of people who not only experienced these life shifts, but they were in it. This was a recency study. So they were either right in the middle of it or had just come out of it within the last 18 months. So that was important because what we didn't want was people who'd been caregivers 5 years ago telling us what the caregiving experience was like, or people who had been forced into retirement telling us what career encoring was like 5 years ago. We wanted to know what it was like right now and what they were going through right now, because we wanted to be able to share this information with all kinds of different kinds of companies so that they could modify practices and products and services for people. So our 5 life shift groups were caregivers, aging singles, grandparents, career encorers, and that definition is people who have left their lifetime of work and are either volunteering or are working, either full or part-time. And then people who are changing their living situation. So literally leaving the community where they'd lived most of their lives and going somewhere else. And for the sake of today's study, I'm going to focus more on the career encores because that's where purpose really became part of the conversation. But I will say, and this is probably just a good place to insert this, in the original Hacking Longevity study, before we dove into the life shifts, we did 16 focus groups all across the United States, in addition to the big study. So we were swimming in data when this was over. We literally had a lot of information. And we talked specifically about purpose with people. We really wanted to know how people gravitated toward that word, if that word resonated with people, what meaning it had for a lot of people. And we came away from those focus groups. And one lady said it really perfectly, and I quote her all the time. She said, "This idea of purpose with a capital P scares the hell out of me, because it makes me feel like I've missed the boat somehow, like I should be doing something that is much bigger than myself and outside of myself. And I'm trying to live my life with little p purpose. I volunteer at this organization. I take care of my grandchildren a couple of days a week so that their parents can have some time off. I'm helping my husband who owns business part-time. I'm staying engaged, but my purpose feels like little p compared to what everybody else is talking about." And this became sort of a thread through all of our focus group conversations. And we didn't bring up this big P, little p, or any of this concept, but it kept evolving, that people saw a difference between those people who had aspirations to create something huge and define a purpose versus people who felt like they had a kind of an ongoing sense of purpose just living in their day-to-day lives. It was really interesting, mostly because for some people that word was really challenging. It was a difficult word for them to sort of wrap their heads around and feel good about themselves with. So I thought that was a really interesting insight. So let's go back to life shifts for a minute. This chart I just wanted to share because it's where our career encores, or our people who really identify purpose as core to their lives, began to step away from the other life shift groups. They were moderately physically healthy compared to everyone else that we talked to in the other 4 life shifts. But in terms of emotional health and social health, they were head and shoulders above everyone else. And when we did the qualitative research where we talked with these people, the qualitative for this particular study was done online, and people submitted videos to us and did all sorts of little exercises to sort of share with us how they're thinking about this stage of their life. And these people are busy, vital. They have lots of social connections. They actually tend to their emotional health. So they were very different than some of our other life shift groups. For example, people aging on their own were kind of a group that had a lot of challenges, and the younger they were on their own, the more challenges they seemed to have. We also asked all of the life shift groups about fulfillment and how they felt, if they were fulfilled in their daily life. This one was a really interesting one across all of our life shifts for a number of reasons, but you'll see that people who are working and volunteering and had made this shift to something different after their work were the most fulfilled in our study as well. So I'm just going to share a little bit of background about who these people were. And I should say that we did this as a generational study. So we looked at Gen Xers, Boomers, and the silent generation. The average age of our encore career was 69.6. So this was largely a Boomer population, although 30% were silents and 3% were Gen Xers. It was pretty evenly male and female, and relatively high average income for the people overall in our whole study, for people 45 plus. Most of them had really long careers. The average number of years in the workforce was almost 40 years. The number of years since their retirement was about 8. 75% said their retirement was planned, 25% obviously unplanned. And this is where our group really divided. So the 75% who planned their retirement overall were our happy, emotionally, socially healthy encores are 25% who did not plan their retirement. The majority of those had had a major health event that created, as I said, that slippery slide, forced them into some sort of retirement. This 25% were also more likely to say they'd experienced ageism in the workplace, which we found very, very interesting. And this was really the only group that identified ageism as a clear issue, whether it was in the workplace, volunteering, or just in day-to-day life. So that was really interesting. So here's what our career encores were doing. About 51% are volunteering. The other 49% are doing some kind of paid work, whether it's 38% of them are part-time, 10% started their own business, and another 5% say they're working full-time. So this is basically male and female, about 70 years old, and this is what their day-to-day looks like. People who work more hours than volunteers do volunteering. And here's the reasons why. And this is another, this one to me is kind of at the crux of what Vicki and Joyce are doing. Boredom is a big issue, was a huge issue for most of these people. But 86% of those who are volunteering and 47% of those who are working do it because it makes them happy. It is their purpose. It is what's sort of driving them. 23% of those who are still working say it's financially necessary. I got an offer I couldn't refuse. I thought that was a funny one. But opportunities to work with friends, opportunities to be of service, those sorts of things. But by far, pleasure and making me happy and avoiding boredom, top of the list. We expected finances to be much, much higher here because all of the headlines that we see talk about how baby boomers can't afford to retire. And so, you know, even when we dove down on this in our qualitative research, in our focus groups online, we didn't see a lot, well, I shouldn't say a lot of financial need. We saw a lot of financial pain around certain issues, but finances weren't the key driver for a lot of things. This was another place where the career encoring people really stepped away from the pack of the other life shifts for us. They prioritize physical health among more than any of the other life shifts, even caregivers, who actually our caregivers were the people who took care of the person they were caring for and didn't really take care of themselves. These guys are really focused on their health. And they do, the number of activities they listed in their qualitative reports was amazing, the things that they do. It's not just things like the gym, but it's walking as much as they can, hiking, traveling, all sorts of things that would signal both physical, emotional, and social engagement. This is about financial strain. We asked people, you know, are they feeling any financial strain? None, 68%, 32% said at least some financial strain as a result of their retirement. This was much more an issue for those people who said they had not chosen retirement at the time that they had to retire than it was for the people who did make that choice. And then I thought I'd just share some consumerism, if you will. We asked people to tell us how they purchase things and where they purchase things and what they were purchasing relative to the life shift they were in. So this isn't just all their purchases. This is about the fact that they're working or volunteering. So almost 40% said they will or have purchased products that aid them in their career or their volunteer service. And they were pretty consistent with all of our life shifts in terms of in-store and online, other than grandparents who have a much higher propensity to shop online than any of our other life shifts do. It's really odd. Well, not odd, but it was much, much higher. But in their shopping behavior, we saw lots of other indicators about health. We saw things like vitamins, supplements, gym memberships. When we drilled down on smart devices, they were wearing Fitbits and Apple Watches to track steps and health-related issues. So yeah, all kinds of little monitors and things to track. There was one guy in his video literally took off all of his devices. He had a pedometer and he had an Apple Watch, and he's got a Fitbit on the other wrist because he wants to make sure his Apple Watch is keeping him honest. And I mean, he literally had 5 devices that he kind of showed us in his, it was like, wow. And he walked or biked to work every day. So crazy healthy. So all of this work around career encores, and this is pretty deep. I didn't want to share too much data because it gets kind of boring. I thought it would be more fun to kind of have a conversation and let you sort of ask what was in the data. All of this work with the encores led us to what we're working on now, which is retirement. And we're trying to find a name for this study because every time we say the word retirement, people say retirement's out of style. No one's doing it anymore. Quit using the word retirement. And we get that. We know that to be true. But so I'm calling it the study of what's formerly known as retirement. So it's like the musician formerly known as Prince. It's like, we don't know what to call this right now, but I'm calling it, what am I going to do with my third of life? And we're just sort of working with that. But to get into that, we just did a study, a kind of a quick sprint with a company called MotiveBase. And I thought I'd share this because it's kind of, for a data geek, it's kind of interesting. But what MotiveBase is artificial intelligence and anthropology put together. And so what we wanted to know is what conversations are happening around retirement topics online, because we're going to be looking at this life stage formerly known as retirement by decade. So we're going to look at the 20s, the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And instead of generationally, which is what it's what I've been doing for like 30 years now, we're going to look at it by decade and figure out how people are contextualizing this third stage of life. What's new? How are young people thinking about it? How is what young people are doing about it affecting older people? How are what older people trying now affecting younger generations? We really want to do a deep dive into this. So this AI anthropologist, what they do is scrape conversations from the internet, not in social media, but not Facebook or Twitter. They're actually going into product reviews, into blog conversations, into those strings of comments you see for certain newspapers, you know, when people read an article and log on and start commenting. So they're scraping everything social media wise that's online that is not Facebook or Twitter, thank God. And then reporting it back, and then a human anthropologist sort of takes this and creates a report. But I just thought this would be interesting to share since what we're talking about is purpose and meaning at the end of life. What they found in this first sprint we had them do is there are 5 mental models floating around right now about retirement. The first of those, and what we do with these is really use them to inform the questionnaire that we're going to do down the line for the big study, which will start in the fall. And I think will be very interesting because of COVID-19, because it'll give us a chance to sort of see what's changed from the studies we've done before. But the first of those was the side hustle, which we're all sort of aware of. It's the shared economy thing. It's you know, Uber, Lyft, all the TaskRabbit kinds of sites, and how people are engaging in those in order to either support themselves or to save more toward retirement, or whatever that third stage of their life is going to be called. The second one was the debt savings conundrum. And this one skews, the side hustle skews a little older. It's actually people in their 50s and 60s that are talking about this side hustle. There are young people doing it, but it's really a conversation that is being had by 50 and 60-year-olds. The debt savings conundrum is younger people. It's typically people in their 20s, 30s, 40s who have a mountain of student debt and are trying to figure out how you save for the third of life when you have a mountain of debt that you have to climb over first. Interestingly, though, we saw a second blip of this among some older boomers who were talking about how either they'd taken over student debt from their younger families during the 2008-2009 recession, or they themselves had a lot of credit card debt going into retirement and were trying to figure out how to continue to save and still service the debt that they've created. This frugal lifestyle one is was a new one to me, and it's there's actually a segment of this mental model called the FIRE movement. It's fierce independence, retire early. Is what FIRE stands for. And it's the idea that you can live literally on a shoestring and save 30 to 50% of your income for those things you want to do later in life. And this is being driven by young people who are sort of rebelling against what they call boomerism, which I find fascinating, which is acquiring lots of things, owning a home, all of those sorts of things. And these are people who are trying to live minimally without trading off too much lifestyle so that they've got money to travel. And what we hear a lot in these groups is, I'm going to work for 2 years, save up a bunch of money, and then I'm going to take a 3-year sabbatical and travel. And then I'll come back to work and work for 2 or 3 years and do it again. So it is a complete upending of putting all that travel and all that leisure at the end of life and spreading it out throughout your life. Then we have the second careers, which were pretty classically our career encore segment from our earlier research. And then this group that we called the search for joy and meaning, or we didn't, the AI people did, the search for joy and meaning. And these people were really a little bit higher income, a little bit higher educated, have tended to be savers, and are really looking at this third of life as a time when it's about them. It's sort of like, I've gotten here and it's finally about me, and I'm going to define this the way I want to define it for myself. Very little discussion in this group about money or financial need. So that's kind of what we're working on right now. It's very interesting because we expected to see people who were all about work or all about leisure. And while these 5 mental models exist, they also sort of collide with each other. They're big circles, so there's a lot of overlap in here. What we know is that this idea of pure leisure at the end of life is not what people want, and neither is pure work. So there is a lot of redefinition going on. There are not companies that are emerging as clear leaders. There are not gurus who are emerging as clear leaders to help people navigate this, this third of life. And so we expect to learn a lot in this study. We want to see what the people who are already there can teach us about helping the people who are, in their 20s and 30s, vice versa. I think it's going to be really, really pretty exciting. This is how you get a hold of me. I'm happy to, I actually have an ebook on the Hacking Life Shift study that I'm going to send to Joyce. It's a PDF, so she can share that, and I'll also share the chart. from the AARP Living 100 event. So anyone that wants that can have it, but I'm always happy to talk to anyone who's interested. And I will quit sharing now so we can talk.
Terrific. Bravo.
Thank you.
I'm going to start off questions because people have been asking questions in the chat room, Lori, that you probably haven't been able to follow.
No.
And Marvin Waldman, who's on the phone, and some of us know Marvin, and as he said, he hasn't showered since April, and so that's why he'd rather not be seen. So
thanks, Marvin.
The question was really, and you brought it up at the end, was about the small percentage that showed interest in the finances. And Marvin said it's interesting, and it was something that we would like to get into or have more discussion around. Was there any other conversation about that, the minimal interest in that finance section?
For the career encores?
Yes.
Specifically? Well, so as we looked around across all the life shifts, I mean, these were the people who sort of had the least concern about their finances. And it was because they were doing something about it, right? So the people, what was kind of underneath some of this is that the people who were volunteering were already economically comfortable. The people who were working had already solved. I mean, that's the insight, is they'd solved their financial issues. In the other life shifts, we saw people who were really struggling quite a lot, and financial issues were paramount to those. The people who are aging on their own, I would say, are the people who were the most stressed financially, the most stressed emotionally about their situation, and followed by caregivers who are really trying to figure out, I mean, a lot of them are trying to figure out how they're going to be financially impacted by the care that they're providing for the person they're caring for. And we had mostly people caring for older adults, but we did, interestingly, have about 10% of people who were caring for a disabled child or relative. And those people, we saw a significant financial burden. I mean, some of them were taking care of people they weren't related to and had been taking care of this person for a long time. So it didn't really surprise us. I mean, what we expected to see, and this often happens, what we expected to see from the career encores was that they would say financial motivation was the very most important reason they were still working, and they didn't. Now, they could have been lying to us. It could be a bias in the study or the way we worded the question, but I think when, the way we asked the question was relative to these other factors. We asked it a couple of different ways. I think, they crave the engagement of being at work. And a lot of people in the qualitative talked about intergenerational engagement and how important they thought that was. And those were people who, when they were responding in the focus groups in a group, in group conversations, where those people who were forced into retirement were talking about ageism, the people on the other side of that equation said, wow, I love going to work where there are young people. And I feel like my opinion's valued, and I feel like we've got a great working relationship. So we heard every side of the coin, we heard both sides.
Got it.
And somebody asked about what our life shifts added up to 64%. The other third of the people, because we did one segment that was just people 45 plus, they weren't going through any of these shifts at this particular time. And it was a recency study, so they had to have been in one of these life shifts within the last 18 months to 2 years. So, so 1/3 isn't going through, theoretically isn't going through anything like this at any given point in time. We also had some overlap between the life shifts, which was interesting too.
Am I muted?
You are not.
Oh, are we allowed to ask questions? Hi, Lori. How are you?
Hi, I'm
Good
good,
morning.
thanks.
Yeah. Let me just go back to the financial thing, because it really is an enigma to me, because if you look at the stats
I know.
in terms of money that people have, or their wealth or lack of when they reach retirement age, and it's way, way different than what you found. And I really am just sort of fishing for a frame for this question. Just to say that it sort of bothers me. It has for a while, but more as I get older, that it seems when we talk about aging issues, we give lip service to those who are like really struggling, and we strive really to help the others who aren't. And I've seen this for a long time. Just a little anecdote. I was once involved with this. It was an AARP and a FAR combination. It was about disseminating information, health information, to people who weren't getting it, for older people, which was a great idea. But everything that they suggested were for people who had access, who had to have reached a certain kind of status level to have that kind of access.
Mm-hmm.
The others just, there was no way, there was no thought about getting the information to the people who really needed it. And I brought this up, and I was told basically in the room, a lot of doctors, that, well, we can't reach anybody. We can't reach everybody, which seemed like, so I left that group, but I feel, I get a sense that that's happening a lot. I feel that the people who have the means, a lot of them could figure it out on by themselves, right? And the ones who don't have the means can't, and no one's really doing anything other than talking about them. So that's all I'll say. And I really haven't framed this well, but that's what I'm feeling now.
I think that's true. I think that's true, and I definitely think the environment we're in right now with COVID has escalated that into people's consciousness, that there is a real divide between people who don't have the means and don't have access to the resources. Really, one of the interesting things about this study too was, and I didn't share this slide because I didn't know if it would be that interesting, but we asked people about their awareness of resources to help them problem solve if they had an issue in this life stage. We did it across all of the life stages. And there was always very high awareness that there were resources available for different parts of the life stage to help them solve problems. But when we looked at, have you actually accessed any of these resources, it was like always less than 20% across every single life stage. So, now we're in this era where people are just throwing content out. I mean, there's just tons of content. There are a lot of great books to read. There's free content online. There are financial planners. There are any number of ways to get information about any of these life stages. And yet the utilization of any of them is less than 20%. So I don't know I don't know if it's a relevancy issue, if it's a branding issue. Of course, coming from advertising, it's like, is it a brand issue? Is it what is it? But somehow, awareness was between 40 and 60% across all of the life stages of resources to help them. And utilization was less than half across the board. So it is sort of mind-numbing sometimes. But then when you think about, some of the statistics about people who don't have online access, don't have internet. We're looking at this with getting kids back to school. So imagine how it is for people over 70 who don't have the resources to access some of this. It's not surprising, but it still surprises us when we when we hear it. So I don't know how you.
If I could just make one comment, I'm doing some work in the community in terms of looking at navigating aging and things like that in the community in Pennsylvania, one of the things that we found was that we're looking at successful aging through a certain frame of what we believe that looks like. So what we found was that there really was a correlation between, an inverse correlation between people's finances sometimes and their search for joy and meaning. So it's like that, flipping Maslow's, the whole thing of like, you have to have this to get to this. There were people that just prioritized self-actualization over finances. It was not that they didn't, their lives were more happy in some cases than those people who had everything, so it was interesting.
Kim, hi, this is Erin DiCarlo from Boston. I was just going to chime in on that. I think there's an assumption that financial means equates to well-being, and that's not the case.
Yeah.
And when you look at the other aspects like faith and family involvement, and we are assuming that finances weigh so heavy, but for so many people that's not the case. So I'm not too surprised by these findings, and it's nice to see that we're deeper than that, right? That we find our wellness, overall wellness, in other areas of our life.
Yeah, and I think that also, as you look into different cultures, especially racially different communities, it's very different from what we have as our white-centric idea of how things should be, how much people should worry, how much people should want, so I think it is interesting.
To piggyback on that, I'm thinking in the age of COVID and systemic racism, are we starting to reassess what brings me joy? What brings me meaning? What might have brought me great joy and meaning a year ago might not do it for me right now. Right. And, I like the idea of having an intergenerational approach to this, because I get my energy from speaking to younger generations and hearing how they're approaching life and what they see as important. And for me, I'd like to see more collaborations like that to get some of that energy, enthusiasm, and joy of life back into my life. Because candidly, COVID and what's going on in our society has dulled some of my enthusiasm for the way I used to look at joy and meaning. And I'd like to revisit that and see how I can be more impactful in giving myself joy and meaning and giving it back to the world.
And the younger generations need that. We need the advice from older adults who've experienced, trauma and markets crashing and wars in the past. Like, we need our older adults more than ever. So I love that idea of bringing the two together, because you need to be heard and we need to hear what you have to say.
And Erin, I can tell you that sometimes you get greater meaning in your life with tragedy, that there's no greater teacher about what's important in life than having some tragedies in your life. And it gives you an insight and perspective that unfortunately you don't want to get, but it really opens the lens of life and makes you really think through what's important, what's not important, where should I put my energies and efforts.
Lori?
Yes.
My name is Tim Rodriguez, the Bay Area here. Hey, listen, they say that technology sort of is a great equalizer for the people who are aging. And yet in my dealings with a lot of people, they're saying the problem is people think, okay, I saw you on Facebook, I texted you, I communicated with you, but really what I really want is a visit. People think, well, you know what I'm doing, but that's not good enough. You read my postings, but really that's not the kind of communication we want. So now they're feeling like in a way that the technology has been used against them instead of a tool, but as an excuse not to do the other thing that they really want. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, back when I was working on the grandparenting book, one of the things that we were really focused on was how grandparents would use technology to communicate with their grandkids, because a lot of grandparents don't live close. We're in a different kind of time where families don't stay in the community together like they used to. And interestingly, at the time we were doing the book, everyone was really fascinated by things like FaceTime and that kind of technology. When we did the life stage study, life shift study, grandparents aren't using technology that much. I mean, they'll say, oh, you know, I love it that my older grandkids text with me, but they're not using those technologies. They weren't during the study. Now, I think COVID has changed that. And, you know, one of the things, I was just on we run a little bulletin board of kind of research questions on a monthly basis. And I was just on that bulletin board yesterday asking some questions. And one of our ladies that's in this group is about 86 years old. She's 83, 84, 85, something like that. But she said, you know, I have Skyped with my kids. I've Skyped with my grandkids. I just want to hold somebody. I want to put my hands on a person. I've been alone for 5.5 months, and I just want to touch another human being. You know, and everybody on the bulletin board was like, oh my God, I know what you mean. But she was the first person to express it. She's like, I'm so tired of people telling me to use FaceTime or use Skype or text with them. That's not what I want. I want to hold somebody's hand. I want my daughter to sit here next to me. And, you know, I think it is truly that simple. And if anything good comes out of this crazy crisis, I think it will be that we appreciate the physicality of being with other people, and the touch and the face-to-face connection with other people. I sure hope that stays with us. I mean, that's, you know, God, let's take some lesson out of this.
Helen Dennis has a question, Lori.
Sure.
Helen?
Yeah, it's really a part of a commentary. Your comment, and hello, Laurie.
Hi.
Your comment that this cohort is aware of resources but doesn't use them.
Mm-hmm.
And this is more of a commentary. I think this life stage is very personal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the transfer of, if you're going to buy a product, I'll read the reviews, I will implement, take information that's relevant. But I think this life stage is so personal that what people are craving for, and I think, Tim, is the conversation. The either affirmation of what I'm thinking or challenging to what I'm thinking or give me a new perspective. We've recently launched renewment roundtables. And we are having conversations, and it continues to grow. Will what we talk about be implemented? I don't know. But I think what motivates people to change in this life stage, I think is personal. And you remember the AARP Reimagine?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I think this was an example, assuming what we would see on our screen will help change our lives. Well, it increased awareness. I don't know if anyone did anything differently. So I think there's a different logic when it comes to this life stage. It kind of defies our assumptions on what people know and what they do. So sharing a perspective, and in a sense, that discrepancy between I'm aware of resources and I don't use it actually makes sense.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Thank you.
Great.
Lori, there was a question here from Peter Whitehouse, where he said, Lori, what did you learn about how important and where people are looking for lifelong learning experiences?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. We had, depending on the life shift group, we had a lot of people who have participated in OLLI programs. Obviously, mostly over 60. But we had a lot of people talk about online learning and how, you know, we had people talk to us about how you could learn anything online. In our focus groups, this guy, told us basically you can get you can get any degree you want online. You don't even have to show up. It was online, Ollie, and a lot of people saying they love the opportunity to go back to school and learn and create something different for themselves. And what, a lot of musings about whether they were too old to do things like that. But that was pretty much pretty much came out in the qualitative. It wasn't anything we sort of counted in the quant. And there was another question about why we use 70 as the cutoff. That was not preferred by any of us. But that is the research groups that help us recruit for for either the qualitative panels that are our online panels or the quant surveys. Because everything's done online now, it's very hard to fill quotas over the age of 80. So typically we stop at 80. It just takes a longer time to recruit. I know it seems to not make a lot of sense, but it just takes a long time to recruit. So it's simply the online factor. And we have really tried to pick vendors who will help us get older and older, because we know people are online. We know older people are online.
Lori, Richard Adler has a question.
Sure.
Richard, I think
I have a hard stop at 2, so at my time, so I'm going to have to leave. I'm curious, you started out with the premise about living to be 100 and what that was like. And I'm curious as to whether, and I was struck by your comment that there wasn't so much motivation around financial viability, but I'm wondering how much awareness or anxiety there was about the potential of outliving one's resources if we are going to live to 100, which is kind of unprecedented. It's not part of conventional planning.
Yeah, we asked these questions directly, both in the survey and in our focus groups. We asked people how long they wanted to live, which was a really interesting question, because the only context people really had for it was the age of their oldest relative that they were identifying with. They would say, oh, my uncle lived to be 97, so, and everyone says I'm just like my uncle, so I think I'll probably live to maybe 95 or 100. But people didn't, that was their context. It wasn't, I'm eating well, I'm taking care of myself, I'm doing these things for myself, and I expect that I will live probably into my 80s or 90s. That was not the conversation. It always went back to someone they knew who was, whoever had lived the longest. We literally, in the focus groups, asked people, they had a placemat in front of them when they sat down, and the first question the focus group moderator asked was, write down in the corner of your mat how long you want to live. How long do you want to live? And we had people who refused to write the number down. They were like, I am not putting that into the air. I'm not, it's like, no way am I putting that down. It was really interesting. And we found very little relationship between, among older people, between like money and living longer. They were sort of like, it's going to be what it's going to be. I'm sort of like, I'm already here. It's going to be what it's going to be. People in their 60s tended to say, I'm finally getting my act together on my health. I'm like starting to walk. I'm losing the weight. I'm starting to take care of myself because this experience I just went through with my parents, dying in a skilled nursing facility was really bad, and I'm not going there. And that was their identification of what they didn't want, that was reflecting back on their health. And then they would talk about the money. They would say things like, well, and also when I need skilled care or when I need assisted living, that's going to cost a lot of money. And I'm still not, nobody in any of these studies, and we've asked it now for, well, many years, but in these last 2 rounds, we've asked about Medicare, what people know about Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and how all of these things get paid for in their old age. And people who haven't gotten there yet are clueless. I mean, I am stunned by people who are in their early 60s who have no idea what Medicare pays for. They have no clue what supplemental
long-term care.
Yeah.
Many people think it pays for long-term care.
Absolutely think it pays for long-term care. They absolutely think when they're ready for long-term care that some magical money genie comes out of a bottle and pays for the nursing care. And it's crazy. They think that somebody pays for in-home care, that they just magically get that in-home care. And when you sort of say, well, that's not the way it works, they challenge you because they firmly believe that that is the way it happens. The other thing that was really interesting about money and longevity was for people in their 60s and early 70s. In the first study, people had a really hard time shifting from the savings mindset that they'd had their whole career into spending. So they were like, when they were required to take their first withdrawal, they were like, no. I've saved that money. That money's there if I need it. I don't want to touch it. And so there was this huge tension between where that point is where you feel comfortable starting to spend all that money you'd saved. Because people did sort of say, they didn't really say I'm saving it in case I live to be 100. They'd say I'm saving it in case I have an emergency, my kids need something. It was never sort of about their own longevity. So I would say that the Hacking Longevity study turned up that people really sort of recognize that they're living longer, but they're not doing a thing about it.
I've got to go. Thank you.
Bye, Richard.
I just had a quick question, Lori. Did you find there was any difference between the answers of men versus women in these different subgroups?
In the life shifts?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really great question. So as you might think with the encores, women, the women we talked to in the study tended to be much more okay with stopping work and not working any kind of paid work. And our volunteers tended to be more female than male overall. But we also had some widows in that group, and that was their sense of purpose and engagement with the outside world. Men in the career encores were very much around their identity and their identity being related to their work, where women were far more laid back about sort of letting go of that identity and going and doing something else. In our aging singles group, interestingly, women seem to be a lot more prepared to be widowed than men did. I mean, men sort of, I think a lot of the men in our focus group said, I expected to die before my wife. I didn't expect to be the one left. And so there were a lot of interesting conversations there with, and some joking about, I know men on their own don't do very well, so I got to go find a wife. Or, I mean, it was sort of like there was a lot of worry about being on their own. Divorced men, the divorced group overall, whether they were younger or older, seemed to be having a really hard time, both financially and sort of trying to figure out sort of how to navigate the next step of life, what it was going to look like. I mean, some think they'll never be part of a couple again. Some don't care. But men certainly were getting on dating apps before women were in that singles group. Women were much more reticent about that. They wanted to meet people through other people so that they'd sort of been vetted and weren't that into online dating. But men were sort of like, I got to get back out there. I got to figure out a way to get back out there. I'm not handling this very well on my own. That was pretty interesting. You know, our grandparents were mostly couples, so we didn't see a lot of differences, except in the grandparenting life shift. Boomer men are really engaged grandfathers, and it is a reflection of how they felt about their father, being sort of not a very engaged father or grandparent. And so they're really about engagement, and several of them called it, and this is also in my book, I actually found this in my research for my book, it's like the great do-over for a lot of men who weren't able to be part of their kids' lives because they were working so much. So now they are way into grandparenting. They're coaching teams, they're there on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes they have wives who don't want to leave the workplace. So when it comes to the grandparenting responsibilities, the men are picking up a lot of those things that the grandmoms used to do, like picking up kids after school and watching them when they're sick and things like that. So that's been really interesting. They find their wives are at the peak of their earning years and like doing really well in their professional careers, and they're not ready to retire yet. So we saw some of that. The caregivers, male to female, the big finding, men versus women, was that a lot more men were taking on the responsibility than we've seen in previous studies. And there are so many caregiving studies out there that were different than what we were doing, and have a lot more statistics around men versus women. But we really did see men, there's a lot of division of labor and caregiving where traditionally men have handled like the finance side and the sort of the contracts and that side of things. We're seeing that become a little bit blurrier, and men actually doing direct, like the hands-on stuff. But it was pretty interesting. And our movers, our people who were moving, they were kind of an interesting group. The reasons they were moving were pretty interesting. Most of them were couples. Some people were moving because they needed to find work. But most of them were moving and trying to solve a problem. They were trying to either find a cheaper place to live, or find a smaller size city where the economy was different, or like out here in California, everyone's going to Idaho. I'm dying to go to Idaho and figure out what the love affair is with Idaho, because everybody here is going there. But looking for smaller, more community-based living situations. But what's interesting is when we separated the group from those who were in their planning phases of moving to those who had already moved, when we asked them about had they solved the financial problem, or had they solved the social or emotional problem they were trying to solve in moving, they were right where they were before they moved. So it's like my grandmother used to have this saying, wherever you go, there you are. And that's kind of what it seemed to be. Moving really didn't solve what they were trying to solve, whether it was financial or social. So anyway.
Let's take one more question. Anybody? Yes, Julie.
Julie, unmute yourself.
Hello. This is an absolutely amazing presentation. I've got 1,000,001 questions, but obviously I can only. One of the things that one of the last few slides, you were showing us the AI anthropologist, and you were talking about the 5 models of what people expect retirement to look like. And I have a question and then a comment. The question is, those 5 models, were they sort of a broad sort of, did that include people from age 45 up to 70?
It included people age 20 to over 70.
Okay, so if you were to have broken that down by different age groups, would that model, those 5 outcomes, have looked very different? do you think?
So what because of the way they scrape these conversations, they only sort of know age by a range.
Mm-hmm.
So,
so if you had broken it down by the ranges, would you then?
Yeah, and they did in the final outcome. So the let me see if I can find that real quick.
And then the question I have for you is, I didn't see caregiving come into any of those models, which I'm a little surprised at. Is that because people are just not realizing that caregiving is probably going to be part of retirement?
Yeah. Well, you know, every study we've ever done about caregiving, people have this low level intuition that they're going to be doing it at some point, but it's never, until you're in it, you're not thinking about it. I mean, and very few people sort of make a plan for it, unless there's been a diagnosis and, you know, someone in the medical community has said, you need to be setting yourself up for this. Just, you know, other than in the Life Shift study, you know, obviously we studied caregivers, but when we talked about caregiving in the other shifts, people were sort of like, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, which was sort of interesting. So just to kind of answer your question, the side hustle, the people concerned about the side hustle and these part-time jobs to sort of fill in the gaps, that was a 50 to 60-year-old sort of mindset. The debt to savings conundrum was a 20 to 40-year-old issue, but we did see a tiny bump in boomers around the age of 63, 64. The frugal lifestyle was a 20s, you know, 20s to 30s. Second careering was almost all 55 to 65, and the search for joy and meaning was all 60 plus. So that's how kind of that broke out.
Okay.
Interesting.
Thank you so much, Lori. It was a great presentation. Everybody, just from the comments, valued the information you provided and the care and time you offered to each message on your slide. So we thank you very much.